There is a version of you that exists for about 45 minutes every morning, and almost no one talks about it. Not the version that checks the phone, not the version that replays yesterday's conversation in the shower, or mentally rehearses the argument it hasn't had yet, not the optimized, routined, journaled, meditated version that personal development culture has been selling for the last 15 years, a version before all of that. And here is the thing nobody tells you. That version, the unassembled one, the one that hasn't quite decided who it is yet, is the only version of you with any real access to a different life. Everything else is just rearranging furniture inside the same house. We've been told that changing your life is a matter of habits. Build the right ones early enough, stack them in the right sequence, and eventually the compound interest of behavior catches up to the vision. That's the dominant framework. It has produced thousands of books, millions of downloads, and a very particular kind of person, disciplined, structured, earnest, who still feels, somewhere beneath the productivity, that nothing has fundamentally shifted. That feeling is not a failure of discipline, it's a signal. It's telling you that habits operate at the level of the self that already exists. They optimize a timeline, they don't change it. And there is a difference between those two things so significant that collapsing them may be the single most expensive mistake in the entire genre of self-improvement. So let me ask you something directly, before we go any further. What are you doing in the first hour after you wake up? Not what you should be doing, not the ideal morning you've designed and sometimes execute and mostly approximate. What are you actually doing? And more importantly, what is that window doing to you independent of your intentions? Because if the science we're about to walk through is even partially correct, then that hour is not neutral ground. It is the highest leverage point in your entire day, not because of what you accomplish in it, but because of what it decides before you're conscious enough to interfere. That's the paradox at the center of this video. The first hour is the only window where you're free from yourself, and almost everyone uses it to immediately become themselves again. Now, the word timelines is going to raise some eyebrows. It should. It's a word that has been dragged through enough manifestation content and quantum mysticism that it barely means anything anymore. So let's do something unusual. Let's use it precisely. A timeline, as we'll define it here, is not a parallel universe you access through visualization. It is the trajectory that emerges from a specific configuration of identity, your beliefs about what's possible, your emotional baseline, your attractor state, the version of reality you unconsciously select before the day gives you any say in the matter. Different configuration, different trajectory, same city, same job, same body, entirely different life unfolding from the same address. That's what a timeline shift actually is, not teleportation, not magic. How a change in the configuration from which you meet experience. And the question this video is built around is this: is there a window, a specific neurologically and physically real window, in which that configuration is still fluid enough to be changed? The answer, as far as the evidence goes, is yes. It's the first hour after you wake up, but not for the reasons the morning routine industry would have you believe. I'm not going to promise this will be quick. What I am going to promise is that by the time we're done, the first hour of your day will never feel optional again. Not because you've been motivated, but because you'll understand exactly what it is and exactly what it's been doing while you thought it was just morning. Let's start with the thing that's harder to accept than any quantum physics. The person you wake up as every morning is not who you think it is. Here is something neuroscience has known for a while, but rarely frames in a way that lands with full force. You don't wake up, you reassemble. Every morning, in the transition from deep sleep through REM toward waking consciousness, your brain reconstructs a self from stored components. Memories, emotional tone, narrative identity, social roles, threat assessments, desires. All of it gets pulled from long-term storage and reloaded into working consciousness in a process that is less like turning on a light and more like booting an operating system from a saved state. The self you experience as continuous, the one that feels like it simply persisted through sleep, is actually rebuilt fresh each morning. Which means every morning for a brief window, the rebuild is incomplete. That window has a name in sleep science: sleep inertia. It refers to the period of cognitive and physiological grogginess that follows waking, typically lasting between 15 minutes and 90 minutes, depending on the individual, the sleep stage from which they woke, and accumulated sleep debt. During sleep inertia, reaction time is slower, working memory is reduced, and this is the part that matters. The default mode network, the brain system most associated with self-referential thought and identity maintenance, is not yet fully reactivated. In plain language, the part of your brain responsible for reminding you who you are hasn't fully clocked in yet. Most people treat this as a bug. It is, in fact, the feature. Simultaneously, and this is where the plot thickens, the body is doing something else entirely. In the first 30 to 45 minutes after waking, cortisol levels spike sharply in what researchers call the Cortisol Awakening Response, or CAR. This is not the cortisol of stress. It is a mobilization signal, the body's way of priming alertness, immune function, and metabolic activity for the demands of the coming day. But here's what rarely gets mentioned alongside that fact. The CAR is exquisitely sensitive to psychological context. What you think about, what you feel, what you expose yourself to in those first minutes, these factors directly modulate the shape and magnitude of that cortisol curve. Studies measuring salivary cortisol have shown that people who wake into rumination, social threat, or anticipatory stress show a blunted or dysregulated CAR pattern. People who wake into a state of low arousal and open attention show a different profile entirely. Your body is literally running a different biochemical program depending on what your mind decides to do in those first 45 minutes. Not metaphorically, measurably. Now hold both of those facts together. The incomplete reassembly of identity and the biochemical sensitivity of the awakening window. And a picture begins to form that is more interesting than any morning routine checklist. What if the reason protocols fail isn't that people lack discipline? What if it's that they're applying discipline to the wrong variable? The standard advice is, use the morning to build the person you want to become. Meditate, journal, exercise, read, stack inputs, shape outputs. And this advice isn't wrong exactly. It's just operating at the surface layer. It's working with the furniture, not the architecture. Because underneath the habits, underneath the inputs and outputs, there is a prior question that almost no one asks. Who is doing the assembling? This is not a rhetorical flourish. It is a legitimate philosophical and neuroscientific problem. The self that chooses the meditation cushion, the self that decides to journal, the self that sets the alarm for 5 a.m., that self is already a specific configuration. It already carries a particular emotional baseline, a particular set of beliefs about what is possible, a particular attractor state that will shape how every input gets interpreted and integrated. You can meditate every morning for a year and still be meditating as the same person, reinforcing the same identity, processing experience through the same filters, selecting the same trajectory. Not because meditation doesn't work, because the meditator didn't change. There is a concept in cognitive science called the narrative self. The idea, developed most rigorously by the philosopher Daniel Dennett and later expanded by neuroscientist Antonio Damasio, that the self is not a fixed entity, but a story the brain tells about its own activity. A running autobiography, constantly updated, constantly edited, constantly protecting its own coherence. The narrative self is conservative by design. It resists discontinuity. It interprets new experience through the lens of existing story. It will take a genuinely transformative insight and, within 72 hours, metabolize it into something that confirms what it already believed. This is not a flaw, it is a survival mechanism. But it creates a very specific problem for anyone trying to change not just their behavior, but the deeper configuration from which behavior emerges. The template itself is the problem, not your habits, not your discipline, not your willpower. The story that is running before any of those things activate, the one that gets reassembled every morning in that incomplete, groggy, biochemically primed window. That is where the real leverage lives. And here is where it gets genuinely interesting. Because if the self is rebuilt every morning from a stored template, and if that template is the actual determinant of which trajectory you move along, then the question is no longer, what should I do in the morning? The question becomes, is the template itself changeable? And if so, when? Under what conditions? Through what mechanism? The neuroscience points toward that 45 to 90-minute window, but it can only take us so far. To understand why that window might be structurally different from any other part of the day, not just psychologically but physically, we need to go somewhere most morning routine videos never go. We need to look at what quantum biology has quietly been discovering about living systems for the last 2 decades. And more specifically, we need to ask a question that sounds strange until you understand the physics behind it. If superposition, the quantum state in which a system exists in multiple possible configurations simultaneously before being observed, collapses the moment a measurement is made, what happens when you are the observer observing yourself? That question is not metaphor. It has a real answer, and it changes everything about what the first hour actually is. The template is the problem, but the template has an edit window. That's where we go next, and the physics is stranger and more grounded than you're expecting. Let's be careful here. Carefully, deliberately, almost stubbornly careful. Because this is the territory where legitimate science and wishful thinking have been colliding for 30 years. And the casualty of that collision is usually the truth. Quantum mechanics is real. Its applications to biology are real, increasingly documented and genuinely strange. What is not real, or at least not supported by current evidence, is the idea that you can visualize your way into a parallel universe, or that intention alone restructures physical reality through quantum fields. That version of quantum mysticism is not what this video is about. What this video is about is both more modest and, in the end, more radical. Start with the basics. Quantum mechanics, developed in the early 20th century through the work of Planck, Bohr, Heisenberg, and Schrödinger, describes the behavior of matter and energy at subatomic scales. At that level, particles do not behave like billiard balls. They exist in states of superposition, meaning a particle can occupy multiple possible states simultaneously until an interaction with the environment forces it into a single definite state. That process is called decoherence, or wave function collapse. The standard assumption for most of the 20th century was that quantum effects were fragile, relevant only at extremely small scales and extremely cold temperatures, washed out almost instantly by the warm, wet, noisy environment of biological systems. That assumption turned out to be wrong. In 2007, a team at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory published findings on photosynthesis in green sulfur bacteria that shook the field. They discovered that energy transfer within the photosynthetic complex, the mechanism by which plants and bacteria convert light into usable energy, operates with an efficiency that classical physics simply cannot account for. The energy doesn't randomly walk its way to the reaction center. It explores multiple pathways simultaneously, finding the most efficient route with a speed and precision that only makes sense if quantum coherence, the ability of a system to maintain superposition across multiple states at once, is actively at work inside a living cell at room temperature, in a biological environment that was supposed to be far too chaotic for quantum effects to survive. This was not a fringe finding. It was replicated, debated, refined, and ultimately accepted as a genuine phenomenon. Quantum biology, the study of quantum effects in living systems, went from a speculative curiosity to a legitimate field of scientific inquiry almost overnight. And photosynthesis was just the beginning. Research into bird navigation has shown that the European robin likely uses a quantum mechanism called radical pair formation in cryptochrome proteins within its eye to detect Earth's magnetic field, essentially using quantum entanglement, the phenomenon Einstein famously called spooky action at a distance as a compass. The enzyme mechanism underlying DNA replication and mutation has been linked to quantum tunneling, where particles pass through energy barriers that classical physics says they shouldn't be able to cross. And the sense of smell, according to work by biophysicist Luca Turin, may operate not through molecular shape recognition alone, but through quantum vibrational sensing. The nose detecting the frequency at which a molecule vibrates, not just what it looks like. Living systems, it turns out, did not abandon quantum mechanics when they scaled up from atoms to cells. They learned to use it. The body is not a classical machine running on biochemical gears. It is a quantum system that has been evolving for 4 billion years, and it is far more sensitive and far more strange than our intuitions about biology ever suggested. Now, here is where we have to be honest about a boundary. None of this proves that you can shift timelines by meditating at 6 a.m. None of it proves that consciousness directly collapses quantum wave functions in a way that selects one life trajectory over another. The Penrose-Hameroff orchestrated objective reduction hypothesis, which proposes that quantum computations in microtubules inside neurons are the basis of consciousness itself, is still deeply controversial, and it would be dishonest to present it as settled science. What the evidence does establish, clearly and with increasing confidence, is something more specific and more actionable. Biological systems operate at a level of sensitivity that makes them genuinely responsive to quantum-scale phenomena. The brain, as a biological system, is not exempt from this, and the state of the system, its coherence, its baseline, its readiness to process information in one mode versus another, is not fixed. It fluctuates. It has windows of higher and lower plasticity. It responds to conditions. Not X, Y. Not quantum physics proves manifestation works. Rather, quantum biology reveals that living systems are far more dynamically sensitive to their own internal state than classical models assumed, and that sensitivity has a timing dimension we've been ignoring. Here is the historical layer that matters most. In the early 20th century, the Danish physicist Niels Bohr formulated what became known as the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. At its core is a deceptively simple idea. A quantum system does not have definite properties until it is measured. Before measurement, it exists in superposition, a smear of probabilities, not a fixed reality. The act of observation, of interaction, is what forces the system to commit to a specific state. Hugh Everett III, a graduate student at Princeton in the 1950s, found this deeply unsatisfying. His response was the many worlds interpretation, the proposal that the wave function never actually collapses. Instead, every possible outcome of every quantum event occurs, each in its own branching version of reality. From the inside, you only ever experience one branch, but all branches are equally real. Everett's interpretation was dismissed during his lifetime. Today it is taken seriously by a significant portion of theoretical physicists, including figures like David Deutsch and Max Tegmark, precisely because it requires no special collapse mechanism and no privileged role for the observer. It is, mathematically, the simplest reading of what the equations actually say. Now, this video is not going to tell you that timeline shifting is literally moving between Everett branches. That claim goes beyond what any current evidence supports, and making it would be the exact kind of intellectual dishonesty this video is trying to avoid. But here is what the many worlds interpretation does offer, even at a conceptual level. The idea that the reality you experience is not the only reality available to the system you are, that the configuration you inhabit is one of many possible configurations, and that which one becomes dominant is determined by a process of interaction, observation, and measurement. That idea is not mysticism. It is the most mathematically rigorous description of physical reality we currently possess. And it reframes the question entirely. The question is no longer whether parallel timelines exist in some metaphysical sense. The question is whether the configuration you wake up into each morning is fixed or selectable, whether the version of reality you'll inhabit for the next 16 hours is determined before you're conscious enough to choose it, or whether there is a window in which that selection process is still open. That window is real. We've already seen it from the neuroscience side. The incomplete reassembly of identity, the plasticity of the cortisol awakening response, the default mode network still warming up. Now layer the quantum biology on top, a system whose sensitivity to initial conditions is orders of magnitude greater than classical models assumed, operating at its most coherent state immediately upon transitioning from the low metabolic, highly ordered environment of deep sleep into waking. The first hour is not just psychologically plastic, it is physically different. There is one more piece of evidence worth placing here, because it connects the abstract physics to something you have almost certainly experienced in your own body. In 1964, the physicist John Bell devised a test, now known as Bell's theorem, that allowed scientists to determine whether quantum entanglement was real or whether there was some hidden classical explanation for it. The results, confirmed definitively in experiments by Alain Aspect in the 1980s and in increasingly rigorous form ever since, were unambiguous. Entanglement is real. Two particles, once correlated, respond to measurements of each other instantaneously, regardless of the distance between them. Not faster than light, outside of the framework of space and time as it applies to classical objects altogether. What this tells us is not that the mind can communicate across dimensions. What it tells us is that the universe is at its foundation non-local, meaning that the assumption of strict separation between observer and observed, between self and world, between the configuration you carry internally and the reality you navigate externally, is a classical approximation, not an ultimate truth. The boundary between you and your experience is less fixed than it appears. This is not poetry. This is the experimental consensus of the last 60 years of physics. So where does this leave us? The physics tells us systems are sensitive to initial conditions at a scale we underestimated, biological systems exploit quantum effects for functional purposes, and the boundary between observer and observed is not as clean as common sense suggests. The neuroscience tells us the self is reconstructed each morning from a template, that reconstruction has a window of incompleteness and heightened plasticity, and the biochemical environment of the first 45 minutes is acutely responsive to the psychological state you bring to it. Put those two bodies of evidence together, and something comes into focus that is genuinely difficult to dismiss. The first hour after waking is the moment when a quantum-sensitive biological system, your body and brain, transitions from its most ordered, coherent nighttime state into waking experience before the identity template has fully solidified, during a biochemical spike that is exquisitely sensitive to psychological context, with the self-referential narrative machinery still only partially online. If there is a window in which the configuration is still selectable, this is it. Every single morning, without exception. But here is the limitation that the physics and neuroscience together cannot answer, and it's the one that will determine whether any of this is actually useful to you. Knowing the window exists is not the same as knowing how to use it. And the reason most people fail to use it, even people who understand everything we've just covered, is not that they lack information. It is that they misunderstand what the protocol is actually asking them to do. Because the first hour protocol is not at its core about action. It is about deferral, and deferral is one of the most counterintuitive things a goal-oriented, achievement-minded person can be asked to practice, especially someone who has spent decades rewarding themselves for moving fast, deciding quickly, and converting mornings into productive output. What does it mean to defer identity consolidation long enough to choose your attractor state before it chooses you? That's where we go next. And it will require us to set aside almost everything the personal development industry has told you a productive morning looks like. Let's slow down here. Not because the ideas get more complicated, they actually get simpler. But because this is the block where most people, if they're being honest, will feel a quiet resistance rising. Not intellectual resistance, something older than that. The resistance of a person who has already tried, who has already built the morning routine, woken early, tracked the habit, felt the momentum, and then watched it dissolve, not dramatically but gradually, like a signal losing strength as you drive away from the transmitter. By noon, you were someone else. By evening, you were entirely yourself again, and the morning felt like something that had happened to a different person. If that's familiar, it's not because you failed the protocol. It's because you were running the wrong one. Here is the distinction that changes everything. Most morning protocols are designed around a simple logic. Input determines output. Feed the mind good content. The mind produces good thoughts. Move the body generates good chemistry. protect the first hour from distraction, and distraction loses its grip. This is all true as far as it goes. But it assumes that the self receiving those inputs is neutral, a blank processor that will convert good inputs into good outputs with mechanical reliability. It isn't. The self receiving the inputs is already biased. It already has a dominant emotional tone, a set of operating assumptions about what is real and possible, a habitual interpretation filter that will process even the most carefully curated morning input through the lens of the identity that assembled itself in the first 10 minutes after the alarm went off. You read the philosophy book as someone who already has a fixed relationship to change. You journal as someone who already has a fixed relationship to their own voice. You meditate as someone who already has a fixed relationship to stillness. The input lands inside an already configured system, and the system shapes the input more than the input shapes the system. Not discipline, timing. The protocol that actually works is not about what you consume or produce in the first hour. It is about when you allow identity to consolidate, and what state you're in when that consolidation happens. Think of it this way. In the first 15 to 30 minutes after waking, you are in a state that researchers sometimes describe as hypnagogic adjacency, a period neurologically similar to the threshold between sleep and waking, characterized by reduced critical filtering, heightened receptivity, and a loosening of the ordinary boundaries between self and not self. This is the state artists and scientists have described throughout history as the most fertile ground for genuine creative insight. Edison famously napped in a chair holding steel balls in his hands. When he drifted into sleep, the balls dropped, woke him, and he immediately captured whatever imagery or idea was present at that threshold. Salvador Dali used the same technique with a key and a plate. Nikola Tesla described his most significant inventions as arriving not through deliberate thought, but through a kind of waking vision at the edge of sleep. These weren't eccentricities. They were intuitively protocols for accessing the pre-consolidated state, the window before identity reassembles and critical judgment reinstalls itself as gatekeeper. What they understood practically, neuroscience now confirms structurally. The hypnagogic threshold is a genuine mode of cognition, not just a poetic description of grogginess. A 2021 study from MIT and the Paris Brain Institute found that people who were allowed to linger at the edge of sleep, in what researchers called N1 sleep, the lightest stage, reported significantly more creative insights and novel problem-solving approaches than those who either fell fully asleep or woke fully. The threshold state itself was the generative condition. So the first pillar of the actual protocol is this: do not rush through the threshold. Not because relaxation is virtuous, because the threshold is the edit window. The moment you grab the phone, the moment you begin mentally rehearsing the day, the moment you let the first anxiety about yesterday or tomorrow take shape, you have triggered identity consolidation. The operating system has begun booting from the saved state. The template is loading, and once it loads, it is extraordinarily difficult to change mid-run. This is not a metaphor about mindfulness. This is a description of a neurological sequence with a specific timing constraint. You have, conservatively, somewhere between 10 and 25 minutes after waking, in which the narrative self is still assembling, still searching for its reference points, still deciding which emotional tone to organize around, still in a meaningful sense, open. 25 minutes, every morning, and most people spend them checking notifications. The second pillar is equally counterintuitive, and it is the one that will create the most friction for high-achieving, results-oriented people in particular. Do not set intentions in the first hour. I know how that sounds. Intention setting is the cornerstone of virtually every high-performance morning protocol in existence. Vision boards, journaling prompts, affirmations, goal review. These are the tools of the morning optimization industry, and they are all at their core acts of intention setting. And intention setting in the first hour is an act of identity consolidation. The moment you write down your goals, you are reinforcing the self that has those goals. The self with that particular relationship to achievement, that particular definition of success, that particular emotional charge around what is missing and what needs to be fixed. You are, in the most literal sense, loading the template, not from a blank state, from a state of lack, because goals, by definition, are oriented toward what isn't yet true. And the first conscious act of orienting toward what isn't yet true is an act of becoming the person for whom those things aren't yet true. You are selecting a timeline in which those things remain in the future, every morning, reliably, with discipline and consistency. This is the part that's hard to hear, especially for someone who has invested years in morning routines built around intention. The issue is not that intentions are bad. The issue is sequence. Intention before state selection is like programming a destination into a navigation system before you've confirmed where you're starting from. The route it calculates will be based on a location that may not be accurate. State first, then orientation. What does state selection actually look like? It looks, frankly, like almost nothing from the outside. It is not dramatic. It does not photograph well. It will not make a compelling reel. It looks like lying still for a few minutes after waking without reaching for anything. Not meditating in the formal sense, not following a technique, not trying to achieve a particular mental state, simply remaining in the threshold, letting the body wake before the identity does, noticing what is present before deciding what it means. It looks like the first sensation of the day being physical rather than cognitive, the weight of the body, the temperature of the air, the quality of the light, rather than a thought, a task, or a notification. It looks like the first deliberate act of the day being a movement towards something that already feels true, rather than towards something that needs to become true. Not an aspiration, recognition, not construction, contact. Here is a concrete example of what that distinction produces in practice. Two people wake up with the same intention, to live with more presence and less anxiety. The first reaches for the journal immediately, writes out the intention, lists 3 reasons it matters, and sets a reminder to check in at noon. The second lies still for 8 minutes, notices the anxiety already present as a physical sensation in the chest, and rather than narrating it or resolving it, simply remains with it long enough for the nervous system to register that it is not a threat, that it can be present without being acted upon. By 9 a.m., the first person has executed their morning routine perfectly and is running their anxiety through a slightly more organized filing system. The second person has done something the first person's protocol didn't touch. They have changed the relationship between the self and the anxiety, rather than the content of the thoughts about it. Different process, different outcome, same amount of time. The third pillar, and this one connects back directly to the quantum biology we covered earlier, is what I'd call coherence before complexity. The awakening window is a period of heightened biological sensitivity. The body is running its own initialization sequence, and that sequence is exquisitely responsive to signal quality. What that means practically is that simple high-signal inputs in the first 30 minutes have a disproportionate effect on the baseline state that gets locked in for the rest of the day. Simple here does not mean easy. It means undivided. One thing fully met rather than 10 things partially processed. Natural light before artificial light. Silence before sound. Breath before thought. Physical sensation before cognitive content. Not because these things are spiritually superior, because they are low-noise, high-coherence signals that allow the biological system to complete its own initialization without interference. The moment you introduce high complexity, high novelty, high emotional charge content, a news feed, a message thread, a work email, you are injecting noise into a system that is still tuning itself. And a system that initializes noise will organize around noise. It will spend the rest of the day trying to resolve a signal-to-noise ratio that was skewed in the first 15 minutes. Not because you're weak, because the system is doing exactly what it's designed to do. Organize around the dominant signal it receives during its most sensitive initialization window. Coherence before complexity. Every single morning this choice is available, and almost no one makes it consciously. So the protocol in its actual form has 3 pillars that are not about doing more. They are about doing less, in the right sequence, at the right moment. First, don't rush through the threshold. Linger in the pre-consolidated state long enough to be present before you are someone. Second, don't set intentions before you set state. Contact what is already true before you orient toward what needs to become true. Third, give the system coherence before complexity. Let the biological initialization complete before you introduce high-noise content. None of this takes more time than checking your phone. It takes approximately the same amount of time, but it produces an entirely different person by 8 a.m., not because a better person was installed, but because a less predetermined one was allowed to emerge. And yet, here is the limitation this block cannot escape, the one the protocol itself runs into when you try to implement it with genuine seriousness. Even if you protect the threshold perfectly, even if you linger, defer intention, and feed the system coherence, there is still a force operating beneath all of it that will pull you back into the same configuration with a reliability that feels, after a while, almost gravitational. It is not laziness. It is not resistance. It is something more fundamental than either, and it has a name in mathematics and systems theory that describes it with precision that psychology rarely matches. It is the attractor state. And until you understand what an attractor actually is, not as a metaphor but as a structural feature of dynamic systems, the protocol will work for a morning and dissolve by noon, because you cannot exit an attractor using the attractor's own logic. And that is exactly what most people are unknowingly trying to do. In mathematics, an attractor is a state toward which a dynamic system tends to evolve over time, regardless of where it starts. Take a simple pendulum. Disturb it from rest, and it swings, elaborately at first with wide arcs and apparent freedom of movement. But over time, no matter how dramatic the initial disturbance, it returns to the same resting point. That resting point is its attractor. It is not a prison. It is not imposed from outside. It is a structural feature of the system itself, the configuration that requires the least energy to maintain, the one the system's own dynamics converge upon. Now scale that up. A dynamic system as complex as a human identity, with its network of beliefs, emotional patterns, relational habits, neurological pathways, biochemical baselines, and narrative frameworks, also has attractors. States it tends to return to, not because of weakness or lack of effort, but because those states are structurally embedded in the system. They are the low-energy configurations around which the entire system has organized itself, often over decades. This is why transformation is so much harder than information. You can acquire new information, build new habits, have genuine insights, and still reliably find yourself back in the same emotional register, the same relational patterns, the same sense of what is possible and what is not, the same quiet ceiling on your own life that you've been bumping against for years, not because you didn't try hard enough, because the attractor is stronger than the intention. In dynamical systems theory, attractors come in several forms. There are point attractors, like the pendulum, where the system converges on a single stable state. There are limit cycle attractors, where the system settles into a repeating pattern, a loop. And there are strange attractors, found in chaotic systems, where the behavior is neither fixed nor random, but traces an infinitely complex, never exactly repeating path within a bounded region of possibility. Human identity, it turns out, most closely resembles a strange attractor. You are not stuck in exactly the same day on repeat. The details change, the conversations, the decisions, the moods, but the bounded region doesn't change. The range of emotional states you actually inhabit, the quality of attention you bring to your closest relationships, the threshold at which you stop pushing and settle, the version of yourself you revert to under pressure. That bounded region is your attractor basin, and it is the actual unit of a timeline, not your habits, not your goals, not your morning routine. Change the habits inside the basin, you optimize the timeline. Change the basin itself, you shift the timeline. One of these is personal development, the other is something rarer, and most of what is sold as the second is actually the first with better branding. Now here is the problem that makes attractor change so genuinely difficult, and it is a problem that no amount of motivation resolves, because motivation is itself generated by the attractor. To observe a system, you must stand outside it. This is not a philosophical nicety. It is a practical constraint with real consequences. The tools you use to evaluate your life, your sense of what's working, your assessment of what needs to change, your vision of what better looks like, all of those tools are produced by the attractor itself. They are, in the most literal sense, inside the system they're trying to evaluate. The person who decides they need to be less anxious is using an anxious mind to make that assessment. The person who concludes they need to be more present is using a distracted mind to reach that conclusion. The person who believes they are stuck is using a stuck mind to recognize the stuckness. Can you see the loop? This is not a reason for despair. It is a precise description of the problem. And precise descriptions of problems are the only honest starting point for solving them. The attractor doesn't just generate your behavior. It generates your perception of your behavior, your criteria for evaluating it, and your sense of which changes are possible and which aren't. It is, in the systems theory language, self-referential and self-reinforcing, which means trying to exit it using the logic it generates is not just ineffective, it actively strengthens it. Every failed attempt at change that is processed through the attractor's own framework becomes evidence that confirms the attractor's model of what is possible. The narrative self, remember, the one Dennett and Damasio described as conservative by design, incorporates the failure and updates its story. This is who I am, this is how far I go, this is where I stop. The basin gets deeper, the walls get steeper. This is the moment in most self-improvement content where a solution gets offered that is clean, actionable, and ultimately inadequate, because it operates from inside the same framework it's claiming to transcend. I'm not going to do that. Instead, I want to sit with the problem for one more moment, because there is something in it that most people miss, something that, once seen, changes the entire nature of what you're trying to do. The attractor is not your enemy. This is the part that's genuinely hard to absorb. The configuration you're trying to leave, the emotional baseline you've outgrown, the ceiling you keep hitting, the version of yourself that keeps reassembling every morning despite everything you've tried, that configuration was, at some point, a solution. It was the most adaptive response available to a younger version of you operating with the resources, understanding, and relational environment that existed at the time. The anxiety that now feels like a prison was once a very accurate early warning system. The emotional distance that now costs you intimacy was once a very effective protection against something that genuinely needed to be kept out. The smallness that now frustrates you was once a very wise strategy for surviving an environment that punished visibility. The attractor isn't a malfunction, it's a fossil of a solution. And you cannot dissolve a fossil by arguing with it, disciplining it, or scheduling it out of existence. You dissolve it by making the conditions that created it no longer operative, by becoming, at a sufficiently deep level, a system for which that particular solution is no longer the lowest energy configuration available. That's what a timeline shift actually is, not an upgrade, a phase transition. In physics, a phase transition is what happens when a system crosses a critical threshold and reorganizes at a fundamental level, water becoming ice, ice becoming steam. The molecules are the same. The structure they form is entirely different. And critically, the transition doesn't happen gradually. It happens at a specific threshold, triggered by a specific change in conditions, and once it happens, the system doesn't gradually drift back. The new configuration becomes the stable one. This is the model that actually fits what genuine personal transformation looks like when it happens. Not the slow accumulation of better habits, but a threshold crossing, after which the previous configuration simply stops being the path of least resistance. People who have experienced this kind of shift tend to describe it the same way, not as something they achieved, but as something they recognized. Not as a decision, but as a realization that a decision had already been made somewhere below the level of conscious deliberation. The transition had been building, the threshold was crossed, the configuration changed. And the morning after that crossing feels different in a way that is almost impossible to articulate, not because the circumstances changed, but because the attractor did. So how does the attractor actually change? Here is where neuroscience, quantum biology, and systems theory converge on something specific enough to act on. Attractor states are maintained by coherent, self-reinforcing patterns of neural activation, what neuroscientists call neural assemblies, large networks of neurons that fire together consistently enough to become the default architecture of experience. These assemblies are not fixed, but they are stable. And they become more stable with repetition, with emotional charge, and with the narrative coherence the storytelling self wraps around them. To shift the attractor, you need to do three things simultaneously. And this is where the timing of the first hour becomes not just helpful, but structurally necessary. First, you need to access the system at a moment of reduced coherence, when the assembly is not yet fully active, when the self-reinforcing loop hasn't yet closed for the day. That moment is the awakening window. The default mode network is still warming up. The narrative self is still assembling. The attractor is present but not yet fully operational. This is the only window in the day when you are, in a meaningful neurological sense, partially outside the system. Not fully outside. Partially. That partial outside is everything. Second, you need to introduce a signal that is genuinely incongruent with the attractor's baseline. Not a counter-narrative, not an affirmation, not a goal, but a direct somatic, sensory, or emotional experience that the attractor has no pre-built interpretation for. This is why the coherence before complexity pillar from the last block matters at a deeper level than it first appeared. It's not just about reducing noise. It's about introducing signal that arrives before the interpretive framework is online. Signal that gets registered at a level below narrative, below the story the self tells about what things mean. A quality of light, a physical sensation held with full attention, a piece of music that has no associations yet, a breath taken with the specific intention of feeling the body as a system that is already alive, already functional, already here, before it becomes yours, before it becomes the body of the person, with the problems and the goals and the history. That signal, arriving in the pre-consolidated window, doesn't get filtered through the attractor, it lands below it. And below the attractor is where change actually begins. Third, and this is the Pico 2 insight, the one this entire video has been building toward, you need to consolidate identity around the new signal rather than the old template. This is what the protocol is actually protecting. Not your morning, not your productivity, not your mental health, though it serves all of those things. It is protecting the moment of consolidation, the 10 to 20 minute window, somewhere between 30 and 60 minutes after waking, when the neural assemblies finish initializing and the attractor for the day locks in. Most people consolidate around whatever signal was loudest in the first 30 minutes. The phone, the news, the anxiety that was waiting at the threshold, the mental rehearsal of a conversation they're dreading. The low-grade dissatisfaction that has no specific object but arrives every morning like weather. They consolidate. The attractor locks. The day proceeds inside the basin. The protocol interrupts that sequence at the only moment it can be interrupted, before consolidation during the window, when the system is sensitive enough to organize around something different, not something aspirational, not something better in a moral or motivational sense. Something that corresponds to a different configuration, a different attractor basin, that is already latent within the system, already possible, already real, in the sense that the quantum biologists mean when they talk about superposition. Multiple states simultaneously available, waiting for the conditions that will allow one to become dominant. You are not creating a new self in the first hour. You are selecting which available self consolidates. That distinction is not semantic. It is the entire difference between the protocol working and not working, between genuine timeline shift and another layer of self-improvement furniture stacked inside the same house. Now here is where we have to be honest about the difficulty. The attractor doesn't give up the morning without a fight, not because it's malevolent, because it's efficient. A system that has spent years, sometimes decades, organizing around a particular configuration has deep channels, well-worn pathways, enormous inertia. The moment the alarm goes off, before you are conscious enough to intervene, the attractor is already pulling. The anxiety is already present. The mental rehearsal is already starting. The familiar emotional tone is already coloring the first perceptions of the day. The old template is already loading. This is not failure. This is the system working as designed. The practice, and it is a practice, not a protocol you execute once and complete, is to notice the pull before it becomes a conclusion, to feel the attractor's gravity without immediately being organized by it, to remain for those critical minutes of pre-consolidation in the observer position rather than the participant position. And here is the question that this block cannot fully answer, the one that makes the difference between intellectual understanding and lived transformation. Can you actually observe a system you are inside of? The physics says, partially, under specific conditions for limited windows. The neuroscience says, yes, during reduced default mode network activity, which peaks in the awakening window. The practitioners across history, from the Stoics who wrote of the discipline of the first impression, the Portia or watchful attention to the quality of mind at the start of each day, to the Zen tradition's emphasis on the quality of the first moment of consciousness each morning, all arrived at the same practical conclusion through entirely different routes. The beginning of the day is not just a time, it is a threshold. And what you do at a threshold determines which door opens. Not metaphorically, structurally. This resolves the attractor problem, but only partially, because understanding the attractor, understanding the window, understanding the three pillars of the protocol, none of that, on its own, is enough. There is one more thing required, and it is the thing that no system can provide from the outside, no routine can manufacture from discipline, and no amount of information can substitute for. It is recognition, not of a concept, of yourself. The specific version of you watching this right now, the one who has tried and returned, who has understood and forgotten, who has shifted and drifted back, who has felt the basin walls as intimately as their own name. That person needs to be named directly, and that's what comes next. Let me step out of the framework for a moment, not because the framework is wrong, it isn't, but because frameworks, however accurate, can become their own kind of distance. Another layer of understanding between you and the thing the understanding is pointing at. So let me talk directly to the person who is actually watching this. You are probably not 23. You have probably tried enough versions of self-improvement to know the difference between genuine shift and the brief euphoria of a new system. You've had mornings where something felt genuinely different, where the quality of the day had a different texture, where you moved through hours with a clarity and ease that felt less like achievement and more like recognition. Like you had briefly inhabited a version of yourself that was always there but rarely accessible, and you've had the experience of watching that dissolve, not dramatically, not through failure or crisis, just gradually across the morning, across the week, the familiar configuration reasserting itself. The basin walls are closing back in, the same emotional weather is returning, the same ceiling reinstalled itself so quietly you almost didn't notice it happening. That experience of that specific one is not evidence that change isn't possible for you. It is evidence that you were shifting without anchoring. Here is what actually happens in the moment of genuine shift, beneath all the neuroscience and physics we've been building. You stop trying to become someone else and start recognizing someone you already are. That sounds simple. It is not easy. There is a version of you, not a future version, not an aspirational projection, not the person you'll be when the circumstances finally align. A version that exists right now, beneath the attractor, beneath the narrative, beneath the decades of adaptive configuration that the world required of you. Not a better you, a freer one. Freer in the specific sense that it is less determined by the conditions that shaped the current configuration. Less organized around what was once necessary and is no longer true. Less loyal to a story about limitation that served a purpose and has been running past its expiration date. You have felt this version, briefly, in the mornings that felt different, in moments of unexpected clarity that arrived without effort and departed without warning, in conversations where you suddenly spoke from a place that surprised even you, in decisions that felt less like choices and more like recognitions. Those weren't accidents. Those were moments when the attractor briefly lost its grip, when the consolidation hadn't quite finished, when the signal-to-noise ratio tilted just enough, when you were, for a few minutes or hours, operating from a different basin. The protocol is not magic. It is the systematic creation of those conditions, every morning, on purpose. I want to name something directly because it matters more than any technique in this video. The reason most people reading or watching content like this don't ultimately shift, despite the understanding, despite the genuine desire, despite the periodic experiences of being different, is not lack of information or lack of discipline. It is a quiet, deep, largely unconscious belief that the current configuration is who they actually are. Not what they do, not a pattern they've developed, not an attractor they've been caught in, who they are. And as long as that belief is operative, every morning practice becomes a performance. The self you currently are, performing the practices of the self you want to become, with a part of you watching and quietly filing the whole exercise under things I do but don't quite believe in. The shift doesn't begin with practice. It begins with the recognition that the configuration is not the identity, that the basin is not the person, that the attractor, however deep, however long established, however intimately familiar, is a pattern the system fell into, not a truth about what the system is. You've already shifted in small ways, more times than you've credited yourself for. The version of you watching this is not identical to the version that existed 5 years ago, or 10 or 20, even if the basin feels the same, even if the ceiling feels unchanged. There have been threshold crossings. There have been phase transitions, small ones, that quietly reorganize something without announcing themselves. The practice is not starting from zero. It is learning to recognize the shifts as they happen. In the morning window, in the pre-consolidated state, in the moment before the attractor locks in, and choosing with the small but real degree of freedom that window provides to consolidate around something truer than the template. Not bigger, truer. That's the only meaningful definition of a timeline shift, not a more successful life, a more accurate one. Recognition without anchoring is still drifting. We established that. So what does anchoring look like? And how does it connect back to everything we've built? That's where the synthesis comes in, and it's simpler than you might expect. Let's close the loops. We opened with a question. What are you doing in the first hour after you wake up? And what is it doing to you? The answer now should be clear in a way it couldn't have been at the start. The first hour is not a routine. It is not a collection of habits to be optimized, or a block of time to be protected from distraction. It is a structurally distinct window, neurologically, biochemically, and in light of what quantum biology tells us about the sensitivity of living systems, in which the configuration you will inhabit for the rest of the day is still being selected. Not chosen consciously, selected by whatever signal is loudest, by whatever template gets loaded first, by whatever attractor has the most momentum in the moment the narrative self finishes assembling. The protocol is not about controlling that window. It is about being present for it, consciously, deliberately present, at the only moment in the 24-hour cycle when the system is partially outside its own attractor and therefore capable of consolidating around something different. Here is the synthesis in a single sentence, the one this entire video has been building toward. The first hour doesn't determine what you do that day. It determines who is doing it. Everything else follows from that. The quality of your attention, the emotional register you bring to difficulty, the ceiling you unconsciously impose on what's possible, the version of reality you select before the day gives you any conscious say, all of it flows downstream from the configuration that consolidates in that first hour. Change the configuration, change the stream. That is what a timeline shift is. Nothing more mystical, nothing less real. So what does the protocol actually look like mapped onto a morning? It is not a sequence of activities. It is a sequence of deferrals followed by a single act of recognition. First, linger at the threshold. Don't rush the reassembly. Grogginess is not the enemy. It is the window. Remain consciously for as long as feels natural, without filling it. Second, let the body initialize before the mind does. physical sensation before cognitive content, coherence before complexity. Light, breath, temperature, weight. The simple, high-signal, low-noise inputs that allow the biological system to complete its own awakening sequence without interference. Third, notice what is already present before deciding what it means. The emotional tone of the morning, the anxiety, the ease, the heaviness, the quiet, all of it is information. Meet it before you narrate it. Feel it before you file it. This is the difference between the attractor loading its own interpretation and you having a moment of genuine contact with what is actually there. Fourth, from that contact, not from aspiration, not from lack, not from the gap between where you are and where you want to be, orient. Ask not what you need to become, but what is already true that you haven't been living from. Let the consolidation happen around that recognition rather than around the template. This is anchoring, not affirmation. Not intention setting. Recognition followed by consolidation. The loops that were opened in this video are worth naming explicitly as they close. The narrative self is conservative, but it assembles fresh each morning, which means the conservation has a gap. That gap is the window. The quantum biology tells us the system is more sensitive than classical models assumed, which means the gap is not just psychological, but physical. The attractor is strong, but it is not fully operational during the pre-consolidation window, which means the window is not just real but structurally significant. The shift feels like recognition rather than decision, because it is the system selecting a latent configuration, not constructing a new one from scratch. Every loop points to the same place. The first hour, every morning, already available, already yours. Already containing in its pre-consolidated openness the version of you that the rest of the day has been organized to prevent from emerging. Not a better version, a freer one. And the difference between those two things is the whole game. If something in this video landed differently than you expected, if the framing shifted something rather than just added information, I'd ask you to do one thing before you move on. Not subscribe, not share. Those things are there if they feel right. One thing tomorrow morning before you reach for anything, before you check anything, before you become anyone, wait. 3 minutes. 5 if you can manage it. Just wait at the threshold. Not meditating, not intending, not optimizing. Just present, at the edge of yourself before the template loads. Notice what's there, that's it. That's the entire entry point to everything this video described, not a protocol you build over weeks. A single morning of genuine presence at the threshold, and then paying attention to what the rest of that day feels like compared to the ones that started differently. The data will be immediate, and it will be yours, not mine. If you want to go deeper into the territory this video opened, the neuroscience of identity, the philosophy of self, the quantum biology of living systems, there are videos on this channel that extend each of those threads. The one on the default mode network and the constructed self, the one on attractor states and why insight doesn't automatically produce change. Follow whichever thread is pulled hardest. And if this video found you at a moment when the basin feels particularly deep, when the ceiling feels particularly low, know that the window exists tomorrow morning regardless. It has always existed. It will exist the morning after that. The configuration is not you. The basin is not your life. The first hour is not dead time, it never was.